A reality check is hitting harder than any divorce paper ever could. Imagine spending years telling the world that family is everything, that loyalty is the foundation of your legacy, and that you are the center holding it all together, only to realize that one day you've been quietly erased from the very story you built. Not by a court order, not by a dramatic confrontation, but by something far more devastating. Silence. Right now that silence is surrounding Kody Brown. While he sits high up in his million-dollar home, convinced that everyone else betrayed him, a very different reality is unfolding outside those walls. His own granddaughter Avalon is growing up in a world where he is practically a stranger. And the irony of that situation is almost unbelievable. For years he stood in front of cameras talking about respect, loyalty, and the big picture of family unity. Yet the biggest threat to his legacy didn't come from enemies or critics. It came from the consequences of his own choices. For a long time, one person kept trying to hold that broken bridge together. Michael T. While tensions exploded between Kody and the rest of the family, she kept trying to keep the peace. She invited him to meet Avalon. She tried to include him in family updates. She gave him chance after chance to stay connected. Anyone who watched closely could see how much effort that took. She had seen her own mother struggle for years, yet she still wanted her father to be part of the next generation's life. But sometimes effort only works if the other person is willing to meet you halfway. And that moment finally came down to something incredibly simple. A gift. Not an expensive gift. Not something flashy or dramatic. Just a handmade scrapbook filled with memories of Avalon growing up. Photos, little moments, pieces of a child's life carefully put together by a daughter who still hoped her father would care. Think about that for a second. That scrapbook wasn't just paper and pictures. It was an invitation. A quiet message saying, "You are still part of this family if you want to be." All it would have taken was a phone call, a text, a simple thank you, but nothing came. Days turned into weeks and the silence stayed exactly the same. No excitement. No emotional reaction. No sign that the gift even mattered. Eventually there was a brief acknowledgement, but by then the damage had already been done. Because when someone reaches out with something that meaningful and is met with silence, the message becomes painfully clear. And that silence created a space. Nature has a strange way of filling empty spaces, especially in families. When someone steps away from a role, someone else eventually steps forward. In this case, that role didn't stay empty for long. Christine's new partner, David Woolley, quietly stepped into the picture. While Kody continued arguing about respect and loyalty, David was simply doing something much simpler. He was showing up, spending time with Avalon, playing with her, being present in the small everyday moments that actually matter to a child. Those moments might look ordinary from the outside, but to a toddler they mean everything. Kids don't understand complicated family politics. They don't care about arguments or pride. They only remember who is there, who plays with them, who laughs with them, and that difference is becoming impossible to ignore. Pictures have surfaced showing David doing the normal, sometimes messy work of being part of a family, carrying bags, pushing strollers, sitting on the floor during playtime. There are even stories that when Avalon sees him, her face lights up instantly. She knows who he is. She knows he's someone who belongs in her world. Now imagine the contrast. The man who once insisted he was the center of this entire family might walk into the same room and be barely recognized. That possibility alone says more than any argument ever could. What makes the situation even more striking is how small the turning point really was. It wasn't a dramatic fight. It wasn't some huge betrayal. It was a moment that required almost no effort at all, acknowledging a gift from a daughter and a granddaughter. Instead, that moment became a symbol of something much deeper. Because the truth is becoming harder and harder to deny. The distance in this family wasn't created overnight. It grew slowly through missed opportunities, ignored gestures, and choices that place pride above connection. Over time, even the most patient people reach a breaking point. Sources close to the family say Michael T didn't explode or make some public announcement after that moment. She simply stopped trying as hard. Fewer calls, fewer updates, less effort to keep forcing a relationship that felt one-sided. And honestly, many people understand that decision. When you become a parent, Protecting your child's emotional world becomes the top priority. If someone can't show consistent interest, it may feel safer to step back rather than risk repeated disappointment. Meanwhile, the larger family dynamic keeps shifting. The once massive Brown family now looks very different. Christine has moved forward with her life. Yanelle is building her own path. The adult children are forming their own families and traditions. And new relationships are slowly taking shape in places where old ones faded away. That transformation is also changing the story viewers see. For years the show revolved around Kody as the center of everything. But now audiences are increasingly focused on the lives unfolding beyond him. The laughter, the new beginnings, the unexpected bonds forming in the aftermath of all that conflict. And that shift raises a difficult question. What happens to someone who built their entire identity around being the leader of a family, when that family moves on without them? Because the reality is becoming clearer with every passing season. Legacy isn't something you can demand. It's something people choose to carry forward. It's built through time, presence, and the quiet everyday moments that don't always make it onto television screens. Right now, those moments are happening somewhere else. Somewhere a little girl is growing up surrounded by people who show up, laugh with her, and make her feel loved. Somewhere a new chapter of this family story is unfolding, one that doesn't revolve around the same old arguments. And the most painful part of all might be this: the door was never completely closed. Opportunities were there again and again. The invitation existed. The scrapbook existed. But sometimes the moments that shape a legacy are the ones we choose to ignore. And once those moments pass, they rarely come back the same way again. If you've been following this story and want to keep up with every new twist as it unfolds, make sure you support the channel, stay connected, and keep the conversation going. Because this family's story is still evolving, and the next chapter might be even more surprising than the last. Imagine spending decades telling the world that family is everything, building an entire identity around being the leader, the protector, the man at the center of a massive family legacy. Imagine demanding loyalty, preaching about respect, and constantly reminding everyone that every sacrifice was for the big picture. Now imagine that legacy slowly slipping away, not because someone stole it, not because a court forced it to end, but because the people you once led quietly learned how to live without you. That is the reality unfolding right now around Kody Brown. And the most shocking part is that the final break in this story didn't come from a dramatic fight or some explosive family meeting. It came from something far smaller, yet far more revealing. While Kody sits in his expensive hilltop home, still convinced that he was the one wronged, life outside those walls keeps moving forward. His children are building their own families, creating their own traditions, and raising the next generation. One of those new lives is his granddaughter Avalon. And here's where the story becomes almost painfully ironic. Avalon is growing up in a world where Kody Brown barely exists. For a man who spent years talking about legacy and family roots, that possibility should be devastating. But the truth is even more complicated than that. Because for a long time, one person in the family kept trying to stop this exact outcome from happening: Mykelti. While tensions exploded between Kody and many of the older children, Mykelti kept trying to hold the fragile connection together. She didn't pick sides publicly. She didn't completely walk away when others did. Instead, she tried to keep the door open. She invited Kody to be part of her daughter's life. She kept the communication going when others had already given up. She made sure he had opportunities to remain involved. That kind of effort takes patience most people would struggle to maintain, especially when you've watched your own mother go through years of emotional strain. But Mykelti still believed there was a chance for her father to show up differently when it came to his granddaughter. And for a while, it seemed like that hope might actually work. But here's the thing about relationships that rely on one person doing all the work. Eventually, something happens that reveals whether the other side truly cares enough to meet you halfway. In this case, that moment came during the holidays. Christmas arrived, and instead of sending something expensive or impersonal, Mykelti chose something deeply personal. She created a handmade scrapbook documenting Avalon's life. Photos, memories, little moments that captured the joy of watching a child grow. It wasn't something you could buy in a store. It was something built with time, effort, and emotion. For a grandfather, it should have been one of those heart-melting gestures that instantly reminds you what really matters. Think about it for a moment. That scrapbook was more than just pictures. It was an invitation. A way of saying, you are still part of this story if you want to be. All it required was the smallest response. A phone call. A thank you. Some excitement about the little girl whose life was unfolding right there on those pages. But instead, nothing happened. Days passed. Then weeks. The reaction Kody had hoped for simply never came. No heartfelt message. No emotional response. Just silence hanging in the space where gratitude should have been. And when silence follows a gesture that meaningful, it starts to say something far louder than words ever could. Because at that moment, the question was no longer about family arguments or old conflicts. It became something much simpler and much more painful. If a grandfather cannot show interest in something made with love by his own daughter and granddaughter, what does that say about the future of that relationship? That silence didn't just hurt. It changed everything. When someone reaches out with something meaningful and receives nothing in return, a realization slowly begins to settle in. At first, you tell yourself there must be an explanation. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they haven't seen it yet. Maybe they'll respond tomorrow. But when tomorrow turns into days, and those days turn into weeks, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. The effort is only moving in one direction. For Kody, that moment with the scrapbook quietly exposed a reality she had been trying not to see. For years she had been the bridge between her father and the rest of the family. When tensions exploded, she tried to smooth them over. When communication broke down, she tried to reopen it. She kept believing that if someone just kept trying long enough, the connection would eventually heal. But bridges only work if people walk across them from both sides. Eventually, there was a response. A message acknowledging the gift. But by then the emotional moment had already passed. What should have been a warm, excited reaction felt more like a delayed obligation. And that delay carried a message that was impossible to ignore. Because when someone truly cares, they don't wait weeks to show it. That moment created a quiet shift. There was no dramatic argument, no public fallout, no big declaration that the relationship was over. Instead, something far more subtle happened. The effort simply started to fade. The calls became less frequent. The updates became shorter. The expectation that things might suddenly change began to disappear. Kody didn't explode with anger. She simply began focusing her energy somewhere else, on the people who were actually showing up. And that shift created an empty space. Families work in a strange way. When someone steps back from a role, someone else often ends up filling it without even trying. In this case, that space didn't stay empty for long. Because while one grandfather figure was becoming increasingly distant, another person was quietly becoming part of Avalon's everyday world. David Woolley. While the older family conflicts continued in the background, David was simply present. Spending time with Christine, getting to know the children, and gradually becoming part of the environment Avalon was growing up in. There were no dramatic speeches about loyalty or leadership. No complicated family rules. Just normal moments. Playing on the floor. Laughing during family gatherings. Being around often enough that a small child naturally begins to recognize you. And for a toddler, recognition means everything. Children don't understand complicated adult conflicts. They don't follow the history of arguments, divorces, or loyalty battles. Their world is much simpler. They remember the people who are there consistently, the ones who laugh with them, hold their hand, and sit down to play. That is how bonds form. Slowly, quietly, without announcements or dramatic turning points. Over time, photos and small glimpses of these moments began appearing. David spending time with the family, walking beside Avalon, sharing everyday life with the people around him. And each of those small moments built something that can't be forced or demanded trust. Meanwhile, the contrast with Kody's situation became harder and harder to ignore. The man who once insisted that family loyalty was everything now seemed increasingly distant from the very relationships he once claimed to protect. And the painful irony is that the turning point didn't require a grand gesture to fix. It required something incredibly simple: presence. But presence is something you cannot demand from others. It's something you have to give first. Presence is a simple thing, but it carries more weight than almost anything else in a family. A child doesn't remember speeches about loyalty or long explanations about the big picture. What they remember are the small moments. Who showed up? Who sat on the floor to play? Who laughed with them during ordinary afternoons? Those quiet memories become the foundation of how children understand love. And that's where the difference in this story becomes impossible to ignore. While the distance between Kody and the rest of the family kept growing, Avalon's world continued to expand with the people who were actually around her. The new routines, the family gatherings, the laughter shared between Christine, David, and the rest of the group slowly created a new normal. And in that new normal, the role of grandfather was quietly being filled by someone who never demanded it in the first place. David didn't step in with big declarations or try to replace anyone. He simply showed up and became part of the moments that matter most. Carrying bags during family trips, walking beside Avalon while she explored the world around her, sitting down during playtime without worrying about cameras or appearances. It was the kind of involvement that doesn't look dramatic on television, but in real life it builds something powerful: connection. And once a child forms that connection, it becomes the emotional center of their world. Meanwhile, the distance between Kody and his granddaughter kept widening. Not because someone forced it to happen, but because the opportunities to close that gap kept slipping away. The scrapbook moment was just one example of how easily those opportunities can pass. A small gesture that could have sparked excitement instead became another reminder of how far apart things had grown. For many people watching from the outside, that moment changed the way they saw the entire situation. For years, the narrative had often focused on conflict between the adults. Arguments between spouses, disagreements between parents and grown children. But when a story begins to involve a child, the emotional stakes become very different. Because children don't create those conflicts. They simply grow up within the world the adults around them build. That is why the scrapbook mattered so much. It wasn't just a gift. It was proof that someone still wanted a connection. A chance to participate in the life of the next generation. A moment that could have been the start of rebuilding something meaningful. But rebuilding requires effort from both sides. And as the months pass, the family dynamic continues to evolve in ways that would have been hard to imagine just a few years ago. The Brown family that once revolved around a single patriarch is now branching out into separate lives and separate stories. Christine is building a new chapter filled with laughter and stability. Yunel is focusing on her independence and future plans. The adult children are forming their own traditions. And in the middle of all that change, Avalon is growing up surrounded by the people who are present in her everyday life. The real lesson in this situation may be much simpler than anyone expected. Legacy isn't built through titles or authority. It isn't created by demanding loyalty or reminding people who the leader is supposed to be. Legacy grows through the quiet moments when people choose to be there for one another. Those moments may seem small at the time. A phone call, a thank you message, a few minutes spent looking through a scrapbook filled with a child's memories. But sometimes those small moments decide everything. Because when they are missed, the story keeps moving forward without them. And once a family begins building new memories together, it becomes harder and harder for someone who stepped away to find their place again. And that is where the story takes its most uncomfortable turn. Because once a family begins building new memories without you, the world doesn't pause and wait for you to catch up. Life keeps moving. Birthdays happen. Holidays are celebrated. Photos are taken. Traditions form. And slowly, almost invisibly, a new version of the family takes shape. That transformation is exactly what is happening now. For years, everything in the Brown family seemed to revolve around one central figure. The husband, the father, the patriarch who believed he was holding the entire structure together. But once the fractures started appearing, something surprising happened. The family didn't collapse the way many people expected. Instead, it adapted. Christine created a new life filled with energy and laughter. Yunel stepped into a future that focused on independence and personal growth. The adult children continued building families of their own, forming bonds that were not defined by the old rules anymore. And right in the middle of that transformation, Avalon is growing up. She is part of a generation that will experience the Brown family very differently from how it once existed. Her memories won't be built around the old structure or the complicated hierarchy that used to dominate the family dynamic. Her memories will come from the people who are present in her life now. That shift is quiet, but it is incredibly powerful. Because children create their understanding of family based on what they experience every day. The faces they see. The voices they hear.